So ladies and gentlemen, it's really an honor and a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to serve as chairperson for this panel discussion on a topic which I think is only increasing in importance as we look at the global political situation currently. The panelists I will maybe mention first by name, then I will say a few words of introduction to try to set the framework for some of the reflections that I would love our panelists to consider, and then we will open up also for questions and participation from all of you. So ladies and gentlemen, the topic of this discussion, building a global coalition for the protection of cultural heritage and diversity. I'm very happy to be joined by Lakhdar Brahimi, Special Advisor of the Director-General of UNESCO, Gürcan Türkoğlu, President of the UNESCO World Heritage Committee, Professor Dr. Markus Hilgert, Director of the Ancient Near East Museum, Berlin State Museums, and the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation. So ladies and gentlemen, as the director and the founder of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, I always am trying to reflect what is the need for cultural diplomacy, what is the goal of cultural diplomacy. And I think as we look at this topic, it's important for us to, as was done by the previous speakers, reflect on some of the challenges that we're currently facing in the global situation. So I'd like to begin by quoting actually an expert on terrorism, the famous Walter Lakhdar, who made a statement after September 11th that I think is still very much relevant today. Walter Lakhdar said the following: "Far from being on the verge of a new order, the world has entered a period of great disorder. In facing these new dangers, a re-examination of old priorities is needed. Cultural diplomacy, in the widest sense, has increased in importance, whereas traditional diplomacy and military power are of limited use in coping with most of these dangers." As we think of the challenges that we're up against currently, such as terrorism, I would argue that one of the biggest challenges we have is not actually fighting violence, although of course many of the terrorists are very violent. But actually, Joseph Nye, when he gave a lecture at the ICD a number of years ago, said actually when you look at someone such as Osama bin Laden, Professor Nye would consider bin Laden actually an expert of soft power. He didn't pay anyone to fly into the World Trade Center. He didn't scare them into flying into the World Trade Center. He attracted them to his interpretation of quote-unquote religion. And that was actually in bin Laden's soft power. So in that framework, I would argue that culture, whether it's cultural diplomacy or cultural protection, is of utmost importance. Now, very often our enemies tend to notice this more than we do, in the sense the first targets very often are cultural artifacts. The first targets are actually those cultural monuments, which are actually so important to our history, although we tend to forget that, especially when it comes to funding decisions, whether it's organizations like UNESCO or elsewhere. Cultural diplomacy, at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, we would see the goal is to educate, to enhance, and to sustain relations with the goal of building trust. And therefore, the final reflection I would make also for the consideration of our panelists is we need to also balance protection and innovation. Of course, the goal of cultural diplomacy is not like a glass jar that you put over culture. Culture lives, it breathes, it evolves. And I think really this balance of the innovation and how one can foster innovation equally important to also the issue of protection. So I very much look forward to the discussion with our panelists on the issue. Once again, building a global coalition for the protection of cultural heritage and diversity. I'd like to begin the panel by asking Lakhdar Brahimi to offer some words of welcome and reflection from his point of view, where you see potential and how we might be able to build this global coalition. So please, if you could give also a warm welcome to Lakhdar Brahimi.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. It is really a great honor and pleasure to participate in this conference, and I congratulate warmly Madame Bokova, the Director General of UNESCO, Mr. Pasi, on behalf of the Atlantic Club of Bulgaria for organizing this conference. I'm very much a layman in matters related to culture. But I have dealt with conflict in a number of times in various parts of the world, and I did see from close quarters what conflict does to art and culture. My last encounter with conflict, as some of you know already, was in Syria. And during my very, very first appearance before the Security Council in October 2012, I drew attention to what the conflict was doing to the hugely important and remarkably diverse cultural heritage of that country. I spoke in particular of a church in the city of Homs, built in the year 59 after the beginning of Christianity. And a mosque built also at the very beginning of Islam, next to this church, and both were severely damaged. In consultation with Madame Bokova, I warned the Security Council several times that the continuation of that senseless war would not only damage Syria's present and jeopardize its future, it would also damage its past, destroy its past. And that past of Syria is also our past. That culture of Syria is also our culture, as UNESCO has repeatedly stated. Things, unfortunately, have gone from bad to worse, not only in Syria, but also in Iraq. I'm sure that all of you remember how the very, very important museum in Baghdad was looted under the eyes of the invaders. There is now a glimmer of hope that UNESCO is not alone anymore, as governments and civil society are mobilizing better to face these catastrophic developments. And I think the speakers who opened this conference have all spoken about the necessity of building this international coalition, and also of the fact that this is taking place. Not fast enough, but it is taking place, and there is more awareness. I'll make three main remarks. One, the perpetrators of these attacks on culture, they do that only after they and others, or only others, have attacked people. So I think we cannot forget, no matter how important cultural heritage is, we cannot forget that in situations of conflicts, our first priority must be protecting the people before talking about monuments. The second remark is, as the saying goes, 1 ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. But in this area, quite often prevention is difficult or impossible. And in general, prevention is easy to talk about, not easy to implement. 3, because of that, because of the difficulty of doing prevention, UNESCO, its partners and its supporters generally arrive when the harm has been done. And what we really should be talking about mainly is how to pick up the pieces. How are we going to pick up the pieces? So, and that is what this coalition should do. As I said, prevention is very, very, very difficult to do. But there is one way of preventing this from happening, and that is by preventing conflict. If Iraq had not been invaded, a lot of the things horrible things that have happened to people and to monuments wouldn't have happened. In Syria, if the government of Syria had responded positively to the demands of its people for dignity and liberty. That's all they were asking. They were not asking for regime change. If the government had responded then, nothing of what we have seen happen would have taken place. That kind, the next best thing, since those preventive actions have not taken place, is to end these conflicts. And I think we have had, I'm sure everybody in this panel and in this room are aware that there were lots of opportunities to end the conflict in Syria, and those opportunities have not been taken. Now there is a new glimmer in hope with these meetings that has taken in Vienna, and the meeting that is going to take place on Friday in New York. This is about prevention. Let me say also that as none of those preventive activities I've just said were left, UNESCO has the lead and is trying to do its very, very best to pick up the pieces and to preserve what can be preserved. And I think we have got now to see how we can rebuild what can be rebuilt. In Kabul, when the Taliban started to destroy the priceless objects in the great museum there is in Kabul, what has been done by the staff, they have stolen a lot of the objects from the museum and taken the risk of really losing their life doing that. They have hidden those artifacts in their homes or elsewhere, and they have brought them back as soon as it was safe to do so. In Syria, a story that has not been in any newspaper as far as I know, 7 young people in a city in Raqqa when ISIS or ISIL or Daesh took that region. One of the things they did was to bring down a cross from above the church. 7 young people in the middle of the night went out, and to the risk of their lives, they put that cross back. And I think Irina has spoken about Khalid al-Assad. A lot of people like Khalid al-Assad, who are not as prominent as he was, are taking risks to protect their and our heritage. So you see, this is, I think we should enable these people who are, there are many, many of them in Syria, many, many of them in Iraq. I understand that now they are taking pictures. UNESCO has already a very good database of all the monuments that exist, but I think there are others that are not known even to UNESCO. So I think it would be good to equip and encourage young people and others in these countries to complete this database by taking pictures, by drawing, by doing whatever they can do to while waiting for us to be able to. Reconstruction, of course, will take place in due time. There is a big debate, as you know, on whether reconstructing is necessary, important, or shouldn't be done. In Bamiyan, in Afghanistan, when you see those niches empty, the Buddhas, it makes you cry. So there is a debate. Do you reconstruct these Buddhas, or do you just keep these niches for people to see that there was at one time these Buddhas there? I would like to congratulate Irina Bokova on 2 things. One, for the extraordinary work she's doing, but also, I think both she and Bill Richardson are here, for the kind words they have said on me, and congratulate Irina Bokova for having recruited Bill Richardson as part of her campaign for the UNESCO, for the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brahimi. We'd be very happy now to welcome the President of the UNESCO World Heritage Committee, Mr. Gürcan Türkoğlu. If you could please give us your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I must begin by expressing my appreciation and gratitude to UNESCO and the Atlantic Club of Bulgaria for organizing today's conference on a very key issue of our times. I'm sure that this conference will contribute to developing of a new security agenda against violent extremism with a focus on education and culture. Indeed, educational institutions and cultural heritage are under a heavy attack of terror, violence, and extremism. This assault is not only material, but also ideological. Therefore, working on education and culture, paradoxically, also appear to be one of the remedies of the problem. I will focus on cultural heritage today because of the emergency and widespread effects of the unprecedented situation in a geography not far away from here. It is unprecedented because it is the most massive and extensive attack since the Second World War, and this attack is ongoing. Actually, in the recent decades, there had been some hints of risks for heritage under conflict in cases like the civil wars in the former Yugoslavia or Afghanistan and elsewhere, and there have been considerable damage to heritage, resulting both from deliberate attacks and from the effects of the conflicts. The current threat is massive and extensive in the sense of the geography it covers, the forms it has taken, the target it aims, and its consequences. With regard to geography, as you all know, it covers a wide area from Iraq to Libya, to Yemen, to Mali, and there have been also individual cases, attacks to museums in Tunisia and Egypt. It has taken many forms, from deliberate attacks to the heritage, to effects of the armed conflict, even sometimes use of sites for military purposes. Also, the neglect of the sites, results of the neglect, looting and smuggling are other forms this threat has taken. Regarding the targets and consequences of those attacks against cultural heritage are also very extensive. Monuments, sites, and museums, among them World Heritage Sites, Sufi shrines, religious sites have all been targeted. Libraries and archives have been affected. Intangible heritage, that is, cultural traditions, are also under risk because of the displacement of people and migration and refugees. Attempts of cultural cleansing is harming cultural diversity immensely. As a whole, a great damage is being done to intercultural dialogue. In face of such a tremendous threat, international community has some opportunities and some challenges in front. If I begin with the challenges, first of all, the extremists and terrorists are impossible to engage in a dialogue. Working under armed conflicts and violence, as you would imagine, with warring parties is very complicated for the experts. Difficulties of coordination and cooperation among actors and institutions is faced with as usual. Resources necessary to face the threat are not abundant. Economic and financial crisis in the world makes this problem more serious. Heritage issue is sometimes considered of secondary importance due to the huge humanitarian suffering and casualties. Therefore, the mission of protection of heritage is multifold. First of all, compensation of what is destroyed is a mission. Secondly, prevention of further damage. Thirdly, a plan for post-conflict period is also necessary. So we have a huge mission in front of us. Among the gloom, there are also some opportunities and some good news, I should say. First of all, I will emphasize the leadership role displayed by UNESCO. I was ambassador of Turkey to UNESCO 5 years ago when the problems began in Syria, and I personally witnessed very closely the leadership role the Director-General, Mrs. Irina shows in confronting the risks to heritage from the first days of the clashes. I have also witnessed her very sensitive and alert attitude on this issue. UNESCO Secretariat was monitoring the developments on a daily basis. The DG Director General was holding constant consultations with the experts, And because UNESCO considers this work at the heart of UNESCO's mandate, since cultural destruction is an affront to common human values, which are symbols of identity and elements of social cohesion. The Director-General has set the mission of UNESCO as, first of all, creating international awareness. I can give the Unite for Heritage campaign, the articles published in the international press, speeches in major forums by the Director-General or other UNESCO officials are examples of this effort to create international awareness. Secondly, sharing of information universally, the findings, the facts on the ground regarding the destruction of the heritage. These were done through websites or through the emergency actions in Iraq and Syria units, which were established after the clashes. A most important mission, which is the theme of today's conference also in a way, is to increase coordination and serve as a catalyst to bolster cooperation and mobilize governments and stakeholders. Actually, this was a major occupation for UNESCO and preoccupation for UNESCO and the Director-General. And I think UNESCO has been successful in this regard. I can mention among many activities the December 2014 conference in Paris, which gathered all the actors concerned on this issue. Launching of global coalitions in Bonn and New York during the United Nations General Assembly. During the 39th meeting of the World Heritage Committee, the committee issued a very important declaration in general regarding the protection of heritage, but with a very important focus on the heritage under conflict. This is a very comprehensive declaration. You can find it in the websites. It's called Bonn Declaration because the committee met in Bonn. Among many other recommendations, and the committee called all the parties of the armed conflict to refrain from military use or targeting of cultural and natural heritage sites and monuments that constitute flagrant violations of international law and to comply with their obligation under international treaties. The committee also recommended the Security Council of the United Nations to analyze the possibilities of introducing a specific dimension of heritage protection in the mandates of peacekeeping missions. Another recommendation was the committee called the state parties and other interested parties strengthening their legislation regarding combating all forms and aspects of trafficking in cultural properties. The committee also requested UNESCO to enhance its international leadership on the operations, also invited the countries to coordinate their bilateral and international emergency relief projects for achieving the maximum possible benefits. Another important document that I would like to mention is the strategy document adopted by the General Conference of UNESCO regarding reinforcement of UNESCO's action for the protection of culture and the promotion of cultural pluralism in the event of armed conflict. Actually, this is a long-term strategy. I brought a copy just to show you that this is not just words, but very comprehensive, very carefully worked out document with very concrete proposals for the members of UNESCO, the governments, but also for civil society, even individuals, because this is a work, as today the theme of the conference is about a global coalition. So everybody can make a contribution, and through this document of approved by the UNESCO General Conference. There are many other, of course, activities in this direction. As we mentioned before, Unite for Heritage campaign and similar campaigns which have been announced on the website of UNESCO. This is the first important good news, I should say. I mean, UNESCO is playing very important leadership on this issue. UNESCO has acted very early, I must confess, earlier than the governments related of the neighboring countries. Second good news is about 2 months ago, World Bank and United Nations, during a meeting they held in Lima, Peru, have launched a push to raise billions of dollars in the bond markets with the aim to leverage financial markets to raise funds to tackle the refugee issue to roots. They plan to dramatically increase economic assistance to the countries hosting people fleeing Syria and Iraq through special bonds guaranteed by donor countries. The primary goal will be building infrastructure, hospitals, homes, and schools. But what I want to mention today is that I hope these funds related, the funds necessary to the protection of cultural heritage should be covered also under this plan. I can give as some concrete example how the refugees, they can benefit. For example, scholarships can be given to Syrian and Iraqi youth, young students to specialize in heritage protection issue. Or some workshops can be organized in the refugee camps to protect the intangible heritage of Syrians, like dances, plays for children, and many others. Another good idea is the idea of a protected cultural zones developed by UNESCO and which is waiting to be heard and considered by the parties, especially warring parties. A last item in this regard is the danger listing mechanism of the World Heritage Convention, and this can be instrumental in the protection of World Heritage sites under conflict. One item, again, as a good news I wanted to mention, but the Director General, Irina Bokova, already mentioned in her speech, is that International Criminal Court began legal proceedings last October against an individual linked to Al-Qaeda accused of destruction of 10 religious sites in Timbuktu and Mali, Timbuktu in Mali. This is the first time that ICC will examine the destruction of cultural heritage as a war crime. I hope that this case will have a deterrent effect on the terrorists elsewhere working on crimes related to cultural heritage. Another issue that I think is very important is post-conflict preparations that can be considered now. International community should begin planning now how to compensate the socio-economic and cultural damage caused by the armed conflict and terrorism. Therefore, once carefully thought through, these plans should be made public and promoted in order to inject hope and optimism to the depressed people of the region. I believe that UN agencies, especially UNESCO, should be given strong support by the international community in their efforts in this direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Türkoğlu, and I have a number of follow-up questions, but I'll save them for the discussions. To conclude the panel, the final presentation, before we start the discussion, is the Director of Ancient Near East Museum, Berlin State Museum's Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation. We very much look forward to your statement. Professor Dr. Markus Hilgert.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here in Sofia. It's my first time. Very impressed by the beauty of the city. And I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, Director General Irina Bokova and President Solomon Passi, for inviting me to be here today with you. Cultural diversity. The events of the year 2015 have taught us a painful lesson. Cultural diversity, the epitome of humanity, dignity and freedom, is under attack. Too vivid, the images of plundered World Heritage sites, burned libraries, and murdered scholars. Too shocking, the fate of the millions who used to live and identify with this cultural heritage, but were forced to leave it behind and take unspeakable risks to save their lives. And too widespread, the fanatics' dehumanized and simplistic narrative, wrongly acknowledging only one truth, only one culture, and only one faith. However, there is also something else that we have learned in 2015. We have learned that we're by no means helpless, especially not when it comes to the protection and sustainable development of cultural heritage. We have come to understand that we possess the political will, the knowledge, and the capacities to protect the world's heritage even in situations of crisis. And, last but not least, it is beginning to dawn on us what would be necessary to put these tools to effective use, what measures we would have to take in order to protect cultural heritage as a proud and visible token of the sheer infinite cultural diversity of humankind. First of all, there are significant political responsibilities involved, such as promoting sustainable heritage protection as a strategic development goal on a global level, or disseminating the idea that the crisis of the world's cultural heritage is an integral part of the global humanitarian crisis and has to be addressed as a violation of the fundamental rights of humanity. At the same time, there are also more tangible challenges to be met when the future of the world's cultural heritage is at stake. Both as a scholar specializing in ancient Near Eastern studies and as the director of the Ancient Near East Museum at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, I know from first-hand experience that sustainable heritage preservation requires academic expert knowledge and institutional infrastructures through which this expert knowledge may be applied and transferred. It is for this reason that today I would like to highlight the role of public expert institutions such as the Ancient Near East Museum as institutional pillars of a global coalition for the protection of cultural heritage and diversity. Established at the end of the 19th century, the Ancient Near East Museum houses close to 600,000 archaeological objects, mainly from Iraq and Syria. Among the highlights of its permanent exhibit at the Pergamon Museum are reconstructions of the famous Ishtar Gate of Babylon and the processional way of Babylon, as well as the monumental stone sculptures excavated at the site of Tel Khalaf in Syria. More than 95% of the museum's holdings stem from regular, well-documented archaeological excavations. They entered the collection on the basis of partage agreements with the respective countries of origin. Today, the Ancient Near East Museum is well on its way to become a public expert institution for cultural heritage research and preservation, serving both as a core facility for cultural heritage protection and a highly visible advocate for the archaeological heritage of Iraq and Syria. It is my firm conviction that leading archaeological museums all over the world need to acknowledge their moral obligation and social responsibility to mobilize their unique expertise for the global campaign to safeguard the cultural abundance of the past. Why is it a moral obligation to engage in this global effort? Because we would not be public expert institutions and we would not have the capacity to help if the countries of origin, now in turmoil or under attack, had not agreed to share with us their rich heritage, and because it is in our own vital interest to promote cultural diversity and academic freedom in these countries. Against this backdrop, the Ancient Near East Museum has been adapting its institutional profile since 2014 and is now actively engaged in research and practical measures that may contribute to the fight against illicit trafficking in cultural goods, build capacity in the area of cultural heritage protection in Iraq and Syria, standardize processes of preventive digital documentation, and raise awareness of the need to develop global strategies to preserve the cultural heritage of mankind for future generations. These activities would not be possible without the generous financial support of the German government and the close cooperation with powerful partners such as UNESCO, ICOM, and the German Commission for UNESCO. Illicit trafficking in cultural goods poses, and this is my firm belief, the biggest single threat to the cultural heritage of mankind. For institutions with high visibility like archaeological museums, fighting illicit traffic starts with taking a bold public stance, adhering to a strict code of ethics, and cooperating closely with the respective countries of origin. At the Ancient Near East Museum, pertinent measures include a general no acquisition rule, a very restrictive policy on the preparation of expert reports, as well as comprehensive provenance research. As the Interpol Expert Group on Stolen Cultural Property concluded during its last meeting in June 2015, data gathering and systematic research are of high relevance for combating the illicit traffic in cultural items. Together with an extended network of partner institutions, including UNESCO, ICOM, the Federal Criminal Police Office, and the German Foreign Office, the Ancient Near East Museum is spearheading a new national research project analyzing the illicit traffic in archaeological objects, mainly from Iraq and Syria. Funded by the Federal Ministry for Education and Research for a period of 3 years, this research alliance features an innovative methodological design combining academic and non-academic expertise. Most importantly, this transdisciplinary research project called Illicit aims at developing and testing criminological methods for an in-depth analysis of illicit traffic in cultural goods, focusing on object types, turnovers, networks, and operation modes. We're hoping that the results of our research may also contribute to the successful long-term implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2199 on a national level. At the heart of capacity building lies the exchange of knowledge and experience between experts. We're facilitating this interpersonal knowledge transfer by bringing to Berlin colleagues from our partner institutions in Iraq and Syria in order to discuss all questions related to the protection and study of archaeological heritage. In November, for instance, we hosted 2 conservators from the Syrian DirectorGeneral of Antiquities and Museums who attended an intensive training seminar in the preventive conservation of cuneiform tablets at one of our conservation laboratories. Concentrated work sessions like these play a crucial role in establishing the international expert networks urgently needed for a sustainable heritage protection on a global level. At the same time, it goes without saying that the transfer, development, and implementation of knowledge need an adequate political and infrastructural framework to be in place. Together with our colleagues from the Iraqi Ministry of Culture, we're therefore aiming at defining the parameters of such a sustainable capacity building framework in the context of the Iraqi-German expert dialogue on Iraq's cultural heritage at archaeological sites and museums, ICASM. A joint initiative by the permanent delegation of Iraq to UNESCO, the German Commission for UNESCO, and the Ancient Near East Museum, this expert dialogue is funded generously by the German Foreign Office. It was inaugurated with a first round of bilateral consultations at the end of July. These extremely productive talks centered on several preparatory topics, such as the current capacity building priorities as perceived by Iraq, not perceived by Germany, but as perceived by Iraq, the adequate principles of implementation, as well as the types of required infrastructures and technologies. Some of these required infrastructures and technologies still have to be developed further in order to meet the challenges of cultural heritage documentation and protection in situations of crisis. This applies in particular to innovative technologies such as the 3D digitization of archaeological objects. Bearing in mind this research deficit, the Ancient Near East Museum has been leading in the establishment of a new Center for Digital Cultural Heritage in Museums, CEDICUM. Financed by the Federal Commissioner for Culture and Media, CEDICUM serves both as a research institution and a core facility for all of the archaeological collections of the Berlin State Museums. Among the center's objectives are the generation, storage, and flexible use of 3D models of archaeological objects, as well as the optimization of mobile and economical solutions for preventive 3D documentation in situations of crisis. An essential tool, both in the fight against illicit trafficking of cultural goods, as well as in the area of awareness raising, are the red lists of cultural objects at risk produced by the International Council of Museums. For the 2015 update of ICOM's emergency red list for Iraq, the Ancient Near East Museum has provided a considerable number of provenance objects, object descriptions, and a German translation. The German version of this timely update has been sponsored by the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation and will be launched on January 14th, 2016 in Berlin. And I should mention here that the Red List program would not be possible without the generous financial support of the State Department of the United States government. Last but not least, we're proud partners of UNESCO's Global Unite for Heritage campaign. However, our partnership with UNESCO in this outstanding enterprise is not limited to spreading the word about the imminent threat to the world's cultural heritage. Rather, we're also developing joint projects and new formats for an intensified mutual transfer of research data and expertise. Coming to a close, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to stress 3 points. 1, we need to realize that sustainability, more than anything else, is a public discourse, a multi-voiced and colorful discursive process involving a wide variety of participants, both on national and international levels. A sustainable heritage discourse among global partners acting on equal footing can thus also become a means of social integration, cultural reconciliation, and post-colonial intergovernmental rapport. 2, a common point of departure for all actual measures towards a sustainable heritage protection has to be the consensus that the preservation and development of the cultural resources of humankind is a global challenge in need of both a global strategic response and the corresponding political will for implementation. And 3, public expert institutions like the Ancient Near East Museum possess a specific capacity to contribute significantly to a global coalition for sustainable heritage protection and cultural diversity, thereby establishing a new operative paradigm for archaeological museums. Whether these public expert institutions will be able to live up to this potential will depend entirely on their openness to these tasks and their willingness to adapt their institutional profile accordingly. However, in the face of the violent cultural extremism and the brutal narratives of hatred and death haunting us these days, museums are able to embark on this promising mission by disseminating the one discourse they're perfectly cut out for, that of social diversity, cultural equality, and infinite human creativity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hilgert. We'd like to take questions from the audience, but before I give the microphone to you, I wanted to ask maybe one question of the panelists. We had a very good discussion so far outlining the role of global governance organizations, such as the UN, outlining the role also of the private sector in terms of financial markets, etc. And just now, of course, the very impressive role that museums can also play. One question that I had is where you see the potential and also the role of civil society, because I think really if this is going to be a sustainable coalition, however the coalition may look for cultural protection, I think the key is partnering also with civil society. Now, of course, civil society means different things also in different countries, but I'd be very happy to hear some reflections where you see the role and where you see the opportunity of civil society to also join in this greater coalition. This is for any or all of the panelists.
Very shortly, participation of civil society on protection of cultural heritage in general, and especially in the extraordinary circumstances we are living, is essential. Both UNESCO and World Heritage Committee sees the civil society as an indispensable partner in this effort, in these efforts.
In the countries concerned, there is a great pride in what they have, which is not only theirs, but also world heritage. And I think you'll find a lot of people not only willing to cooperate with UNESCO, with museums like yours in Berlin, but also to take risks. The thing is, how are you going to identify them? How are you going to contact them? How are you going to work with them? In a place like Iraq, it's now relatively easy. It's not perfect, but it is relatively easy. In Syria, it's a little bit more difficult. But there are organizations that exist inside and have also branches outside. I think one should identify them. And one of the things that need to be done is, I think, and quite a few people are working on that. Few NGOs from outside, in the United States in particular, is to see how they can, cooperate with the means they have, taking photos, writing, about a small monument or an archaeological site that has been affected, and saying how it was and so on. I think there is a lot of work that they are willing to do, they can do, if UNESCO and others can be in touch with them and help them and encourage them to do this work.
I think that when you talk about a sustainable protection of cultural heritage, you cannot discount the civil society and the contribution civil society can make. I think Ambassador Richardson pointed this out earlier. As you know, UNESCO has developed a strategic program of the 5 C's, and one of the C's is community involvement. And I think this shows how important it is to have a local community that is willing to dedicate resources and time to the protection of cultural heritage, which means you don't only have to empower the local communities, but you also have to educate them. And this starts in kindergarten, this starts in primary school. This is why it's so important to bring the topic of the protection of cultural heritage, also the topic of illicit trafficking in cultural objects, into schools, because this is where it starts. And you also, of course, need an academic infrastructure so that the expert knowledge is present in the country that is concerned, and is not subjected to the import of knowledge that comes from the global north. I think this is very important, that in times of a post-colonial relationship of states, you have expert knowledge in the country that can sustain and develop itself.
No, thank you for that. And I think in many ways what is needed is some sort of an architecture in that sense. I think we all agree the potential is there. The question, of course, really then remains how one does that. And I think there, especially as one looks at civil society in different parts of the world, can also have very different manifestations. So no, thank you for those reflections. Let me now maybe give the possibility to you to pose questions or comments. I see already a few hands. Looks like we have a wireless microphone. And if you could also briefly introduce yourself, that would be interesting for the panelists. So we know also where you're from. Please.
Thank you. My name is Margarita Keshava. I'm representing a coalition for safeguarding cultural and natural heritage 5 years ago. It is called Interpret Europe. It is based in Germany. It also unifies organizations from US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and so on. This organization is dealing with interpretation of cultural and natural heritage. So I was carefully listening to all of you, and I think that this is the link when we speak about prevention or sustainability or the role of museums, because we need the message delivered to the minds, to the hearts, and to the souls of people who and transfer not only information but also knowledge to them about the preciousness of heritage. And we are dealing quite successfully. Last year, we had a conference in Krakow on interpreting sensitive heritage. It was maybe too early now or the next years. We may come back to the same concept, having in mind the developments in our neighborhood of Europe. What I mean to say is that it is not, it is a question, but also a request and a plea to all of you. We would be very much interested to cooperate and collaborate and to exchange our experience. And one small thing I would also like to mention about the loss, very significant loss in Syria. It was when the genetic resource collection of Syria was bombed. And this is was a huge loss for the community because all the genetic resource material disappeared. Hopefully, shortly before that, it was saved in Svalbard. I met one of those Syrians who were part of that, of those people who took the collection as to back it up in Svalbard, in Norway. And a few months ago, they asked Svalbard to give it back to them to use it for reproduction somewhere else in the world. They didn't say where. So, I would really like and be happy if we can establish some working contacts with you and work on that in that field. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to exploring those opportunities. Additional questions or comments for the very prestigious panel? Yes, over here.
So good afternoon. My name is Borislav Historic, a professional journalist and a member of the management board of the Union of Bulgarian Journalists. So my question could sound a little bit idealistic or romantic, but it's addressed to all honorable members of our first panel. And the question is, do you see any possibilities of contacting, probably directly, some of the more reasonable, sober, but influential persons of ideal, ideas and so on, just to be aware of the cultural heritage and to do their best to preserve at least these areas rich in cultural monuments? Because probably this could be the most efficient way of protection. Thank you very much. It's addressed to all members of the panel.
You know, if you are talking about the fighters, ISIS, Nusra, all the bad guys. Yeah. I think things are different from one place to the other. I can tell you a story about Afghanistan. Mullah Muhammad Omar, the leader of the Taliban, when they took Bamiyan, and some of their young commanders started talking about destroying the Buddhas. I happened to meet him soon after that, and we had a long discussion. And we are talking here in 1999. You know, they took Bamiyan in 1998, and they destroyed the Buddhas in 2000. In 1999, this is not a story I heard from somebody. This is a personal, one-to-one discussion with Mullah Muhammad Omar. After a long discussion, he told me the following. Because I told him, you know, these Buddhas are part of the culture of countries like Japan that are helping Afghanistan, very, very much. He told me this is not part of the culture of Japan, it's part of the culture of Afghanistan. And nobody will touch them. So, what made Mullah Omar change his mind from in 1 year, then to be adamant in saying that the Buddhas must be destroyed, and they were destroyed. So in some cases, I think if, other people must have talked to him after I did. But perhaps people like me did not continue to talk to him. So in this case, maybe an opportunity was lost. At present, in Syria and Iraq, I don't think that people from ISIS, anybody in ISIS will be willing to listen to anything that you or I or anybody else can tell them. But others can. And I am absolutely certain that within the armed groups in Syria, quite a few are probably, no, it's not probably, I'm sure, that quite a few are doing their very, very best to protect their heritage. But on the other hand, probably the leaders, especially of ISIS, are not interested in any, there is nothing you can do to change their mind.
I would like to second that, because when you look at the situation in Syria, it's not just Daesh or ISIS, but it's also other militant Islamist groups that are plundering heritage sites and museums to earn money. And we know from cases where, again, the local community has used existing connections to talk to the leaders, the new leaders of these groups, and talk them out of plundering very successfully. This, again, underlines the importance of effective and empowered local communities, because it's usually people on both sides who've known each other for a very long time, both the militant groups and the people that are trying to protect museums and heritage. So I think, yes, it can be done. In some cases, especially in Syria right now, it is being done. But at the same time, you're walking a very, very thin line, morally and ethically, when you talk to potential future stakeholders. You always have to bear that in mind. You have to know whom you're talking to. And I think this is a decision that has to be made on a case-to-case basis on moral and ethical grounds.
As you said, it's an idealistic thing, but I heard of I have an anecdote about Mosul. I heard that when Daesh was attempting to destroy a religious site, maybe a Sufi shrine, the women of the town surrounded the site and tried to prevent Daesh destroying the shrine or site. And I heard that, of course, this is not a confirmed anecdote, but I heard that they have succeeded in deterring Daesh from doing this, yes. So there are good examples sometimes.
Thank you very much. But what I really meant is UNESCO as an organization. Thank you very much for the answers, but what I really meant was also UNESCO as an institution or other governmental or non-governmental agencies, not only the local communities, and using their personal private acquaintances with some leaders of these groups.
This is a very complicated thing because to have a dialogue with terrorists is one of the most difficult and impossible missions, I think. But of course, utmost should be done to reach the people. For example, this social media campaigns, I'm sure, is reaching to members or sympathizers of Daesh also in the occupied parts. And also there have been some, for example, about Palmyra, there were hesitations because they announced that the site was destroyed and then it was not confirmed. So we thought they were deterred from doing so, but also it's very difficult to get confirmed information from those towns occupied by Daesh.
No, and I would agree. I think obviously we need to use every tool at our disposal. So there, of course, if there are opportunities, whether it's for UNESCO or other organizations, those opportunities should be taken. However, the point I made in the beginning, unfortunately, very often these are intentional acts of destruction as opposed to unintentional. And in that case, I think, as they were saying, it's very hard to negotiate with terrorists who very often are intentionally destroying the culture, sometimes as priority one. So therefore, of course, it can be almost impossible. We have actually run out of time, unfortunately, for the panel. So I think this is an occasion maybe to conclude the formal part of the discussion. We have a coffee break, so hopefully during the coffee break we can continue in an informal way. But I wanted to thank the panelists for, I think, a very thought-provoking discussion. We didn't come up with the answers, so to speak, of how to design this coalition, but we certainly did underline the importance. And I think I speak on behalf of all of the panelists in saying that we are all eager and open to establish partnerships that would lead in the direction of this coalition. So we'd be very happy also to approach any of you later on if there are any other specific proposals for how we can actually create such a coalition. So I'd like to ask you in please joining and expressing our sincere gratitude to all of the panelists for the discussion.